Oh, I'm British, so we try to let people sit down. It's politeness, but it's okay. All right, so good afternoon to everyone, and welcome here to our panel, where Airbus is taking a look at what's next in space, and how we work together to push the technological boundaries and build a better future for both in space and here on the Earth. So my name is Laura Todd. I am happily in a role where I'm head of future programs for space exploration in Airbus. And as I'm sure you're all aware, our purpose in Airbus is we pioneer sustainable aerospace for a safe and united world. In space exploration that we're doing at the moment, we have a proud heritage, and I include things such as ATV or Columbus. And we're also obviously heavily involved in International Space Station operations, the return to the moon with the Artemis mission, where we've provided essentially all the systems that enable those astronauts to go there and come back alive. We're also proud in our overall heritage as a company to be the architect and integrator of incredibly complex systems. And we do this towards our long-term vision, which includes what's going on in the next-gen space stations and, of course, the lunar ecosystem and how we can have a sustainable human presence on the moon. Importantly for us, though, it's that we are an enabling platform that bring together the different components and elements that are needed for that end-to-end human experience in space. We in Airbus don't think we're going to do everything, but we want to work together with startups, with the SMEs, with people with the same vision and values that we do to deliver that end human goal. So to do this, it's absolutely clear that we're going to need more than launchers and space stations. But what do we need in terms of habitation, energy, resource management, food? My preferred one also, I'm looking forward, apparently we now have champagne that's drinkable in space, so I heard that we need to all go try that. And of course, things like medicine, how do we keep people alive, especially on those long-term missions? So that's why it is my pleasure to introduce today our panel, who are bringing all these different perspectives and their ideas. So I'll start off with Ms. So-Young Chung, who is a senior researcher at the Strategic and Planning Directorate of CARI, coordinating CARI's research strategy and planning activities. She also serves as a delegate in the International Space Exploration Coordination Group and COPUS. So welcome to you, So-Young. On my left here directly is Mr. Raphael Rudkin, who is the managing partner of E2MC Ventures, a space-focused early-stage venture capital firm, and has got lots of interesting perspectives. On my right, Dr. Antonino Salmeri, who is a space lawyer with multiple degrees, I might add, specialized in the governance of space resource and lunar activities, and is currently working as policy analyst at the Open Lunar Foundation. He is also, and this is something that I particularly appreciate, the policy and advocacy coordinator at Space Generation Advisory Council, so really driving the young vision. And finally, a friend of mine, Mr. Peter Weiss, who is the founder and CEO of Spartan Space, a French startup working on habitation systems, which develops Eurohab, a habitat payload for our own beloved EL3 that the company wants to offer as a service, like an Airbnb for the moon. So I will obviously be one of the first people to use your service. So, if you'd like to welcome my panel, so a quick round of applause for them just to get started. Thank you. So I'd like to have an open discussion. So for each of you, an open question. Could you share what is your vision about why space is important for us as human beings? And what is your vision for the next 10 years? And maybe, Peter, you'd like to start.
Yeah, sure. I'll start with the second part of the question. So the next 10 years, that makes 2032, if I'm not wrong. Normally, we should have had some crewed missions on the lunar surface. I very much believe in that. I'm a roboticist from education. I have a PhD in space robotics, but I very much believe in human spaceflight because it's important. It's for inspiration. So, as I said, I think the important thing is we'll have human astronauts on the lunar South Pole normally. several missions. And here maybe I'll go rather in the European perspective because, yeah, it's important that Europe is playing a significant role in here with the USA and other nations targeting the South Pole. And I think what Europe could bring in here is all concerning lunar logistics, meaning the elements around these human missions, like, of course, habitation systems, communication, surface mobility, things like that. So I hope that that this is what we can bring in the coming years to these missions to the moon. And these are technologies that will be coming back to Earth, of course. So we work with Spartan Space on habitation systems. In that frame, you have to tackle several things like energy consumption, energy management, water management, CO2 reduction. These are all keywords that I believe should come back to Earth and maybe being applied in normal households. So this is what I hope will be coming back from the moon to Earth.
If I may. Wonderful vision, and I really like to emphasize the importance of the infrastructure aspect, right? When Buzz Aldrin went on the moon, he described it as a magnificent desolation. And for me, this is not just an inspiring sentence from the second man on the moon, it's also like a reality that allows us a possibility, right? The moon is like a blank page. We can picture on it anything we want. And so in 10 years, I hope to see the first shared infrastructure developed on the moon. Because like when we imagine the moon, we can imagine as if we're building a city over there, and you would start with the basic infrastructure, but you would start together. You would not build replicas of the same thing just because you didn't manage to coordinate with the others. So I also like the part that you said before, everyone is going there, but no one is going alone. And we need to do a little bit more. That's probably my challenge for the next 10 years, to connect the community so that this infrastructure is not a duplicate series of, you know, landing pads and power systems and storage spaces, but it's one big set that we can share and, first of all, develop all together.
Yeah, I agree with those visions you're laying out here. Of course, as a venture capitalist, we also hope over the next 10 years we're really going to perfect what we can do in the lower Earth orbit economy, that we really make space work for Earth, because there's so many use cases in remote sensing, there's so many upcoming use cases for microgravity manufacturing where we can really improve life here. But I do think deep space, the moon, and then Mars, and then onwards is really, really important. I mean, the moon is a staging ground for Mars and anything else that we're doing. I also think that the inspirational aspect here is really important. The last time we went to the moon in a crude way, I mean, you can read those stories. It inspired many of the prominent Silicon Valley entrepreneurs in the 1970s. It inspired many people to go study STEM fields. And I really think that's a very, very important aspect that we cannot forget. I do agree the infrastructure element here is that has to be the first step. Actually, the first step has to be that we prove again that there's a reliable, frequent, and relatively cheap transport capability. So I'm really cheering, for example, that all of these CLIPS missions that are coming up to the moon are going to work. Then we have to prove we can reliably do it in a crude way as well. And that's the first step. And then we get to the infrastructure. I do believe the sort of shared infrastructure model may be a good one. There may be scope for public-private partnerships. And we have precedent on Earth. You know, sometimes we have done great explorations on Earth many centuries ago, sometimes even, right? And yes, the moon is a very hostile environment. It seems very far away, but the moon is actually, it's a few days away and a 1.5 second communications delay. The people in the, you know, centuries ago who went to places like North America, Latin America, Australia, that was like a 6-month journey and there was no communication. So in a way, in some ways, it's actually easier.
Right. So let me answer the first question. Why is space important? Because it's there. It offers us potential. And yes, there are political reasons, economic reasons, all other reasons that you can think of. But I think in the end, it's the human nature to realize potentials. And because space is there, it gives us potential. And as for my vision for the next 10 years, you have already said what is actually going to happen in space, especially on the moon. So I will offer my personal vision, and it also comes with the emerging space agency's perspective. And I really want to see for the next 10 years more more countries join space exploration. Korea has already joined the lunar Invention. We have just launched our lunar orbiter. This year, it's on its way to the moon right now. And we plan to launch lunar lander and rover as well. But it's not just Korea. There are other countries like Australia, Mexico, UAE, even countries that you might not know that have lunar programs like Thailand as well. So I want to see more countries being involved in space exploration. And along in that line, I also want to see more people become people to think that they can be involved in space. So in the next 10 years, many things will be realized. Not everything that we dream of. But then people who grow up seeing what can be done in the next 10 years will dream of something else. And I also want to see more people who does not have space background to be involved, to become involved in space. Sometimes when you see people, when you meet people and say you're involved in the space sector, people are like, oh, that's cool, but I'm not that, right? But then from now on, I think people will start imagining themselves becoming involved in space, even if they're not rocket scientists, even if they don't have any degree in science and technology. There are different ways to get involved, and even if you're from different sector, now you can relate yourself to space.
First of all, I mean, I really appreciate all your answers because it's kind of aligned with how we see it going forward in the future in particular. And you've all mentioned it about the moon, but what is it specifically then do we think for the lunar ecosystem and why we should use that as the focal point? Because I happen to think low Earth orbit has its place for doing rapid testing to start working in a more agile DevOps way. But I like some of your answers. So if you could expand on that, why particularly as our closest neighbor, as you say, it's only a few days away, which is nothing. But what do you see then as the real value added from the lunar ecosystem? So I don't know. Oh, I should also point out, if anyone wants to ask any questions, because this will be an interactive session, please do so through the IAF site. So, or with the QR code there. Thank you.
So it's to me, Charles. Yeah, why the moon? I mean, often you hear, okay, the moon is just a step towards Mars. I do not agree with that. The moon is the step towards Mars. It's really an important etap where we have to go first before thinking about going further. We cannot talk about missions to Mars, especially human missions, of course, to Mars, without returning to the moon. And here in particular, the lunar South Pole is very important. Everybody knows why we want to go there, because there are certain resources. So it's quite a particular region in the on the lunar surface. But one has to understand it's an extremely small region, actually. It's as big as Paris. And we were talking. You just mentioned this term of magnificent desolation. I think it will be looking maybe like we see here on the screen, with a lot of actors and things going on around there. Important thing for me is really we have to be there. And what you mentioned before, I might be a little bit brutal, but the nations who will not be implied in lunar surface operations in the coming years will not be the nations that go to Mars further. Nobody can tell me that. I don't believe in that. And actually there will be, I don't want to call it a struggle, but there will be a little bit of discussion about who will use these resources. There are not so many neither. Who will position themselves, and so it's utmost important being on the moon. And again, I underline the European point of view here. We have to be implied. We have to be implicated in lunar surface operation, not only orbit.
And yeah, we often hear the dynamic of moon to Mars or the moon forward to Mars. I understand that because there are colleagues that are really also into Mars. But in my view, the moon should be for the moon. I mean, obviously, if there is usefulness in going to the moon as a staging act for Mars, that's bonus. But the moon is, some people characterize it as the eighth continent, right? It's like Earth. It's even made of the same materials. It originated from Earth. It's there. We just haven't gotten to the point that we're able to settle. And so that's, I think it's the natural step in our society. You know, we've been everywhere on Earth, even the deep sea. And the next step is the moon, but because of the moon, not because of another planet that we want to go or because the rest of the solar system. Because that will drive investment and ideas to stay on the moon. Because if we imagine the moon just as a stepping stone, then how can we say that we're going to be there on a permanent basis? Because then it's not permanent anymore. It's just until we figure out how to go to Mars. And I don't like that. I think the point should be, let's go on the moon. There are several reasons. One of them is that it will be useful for Mars, but it's not the first one. It's not the main one. And then in terms of the ecosystem, I also would like to see something like that. And as I said before, the idea of going at this together, it may sound naive, but it's precisely the reason why we have to go about it, to involve more countries and to have more ideas. Because again, if one decides to develop an infrastructure or a system that only works for that entity or that group of countries, we're killing innovation. We want to develop an economy on the moon. Well, economy works with customers, and customers should be from everywhere. And the more people we involve, the more people will provide services, the more dynamic and rich the moon will be. That's the only way to develop it in a cost-effective manner and in a way that lasts. If we have to stage this 10, 15 years just for the sake of some countries, then it doesn't really work, I think. That's why it has to be truly an international effort, not just because we want to be nice to each other, but because it's the only way that it's going to work.
Yeah, I've touched upon some of these points already. I do just think it's such a logical testing ground, right? There's just many things we can't do in Earth orbits because in Earth orbits the conditions are still relatively nice. The moon is the closest thing where we have where it's just, you're just brutally exposed to radiation because there's no magnetosphere, there's nothing else that shields you. There's no atmosphere, no meaningful atmosphere, right? The gravity environment is slightly different, so you can experiment with a lot of things. But I want to make it clear, it's not just experimenting with technological things. Of course, that's important that you sort of test things like, okay, how can we exploit resources? What can we do with those resources? The in situ resource utilization. What can we do? What kind of habitats could be built? Artificial habitats or lava tubes and things like that. It's not only technology. I also see it as a testing ground for basically things like legal and societal aspects, right? Before we go all the way to Mars, we can test out some of these things on the moon, right? And see whether we can actually live together in a civilized way on the moon before we go to Mars. And then it's going to be really complicated if we find out we can't live together in a civilized way.
Right. And we have touched upon this already. So the moon is important because it could be a stepping stone to other stuff, to Mars and other destinations. And moon is important in itself as well, source of inspiration, of science, and proving ground for technologies. But I think what is most important here is the fact that that lunar economy, I would actually like to call it the cislunar economy. Cislunar in the sense that it's the moon and the Earth. And what really would make the change is that connection between the Earth and the moon. If you just say lunar economy, it gives you an idea that that moon is an enclosed sphere of its own, that it can sustain on its own. Yes, that's something that we are aiming for, but that connection between the Earth and Earth-bound activities or orbital activities around the Earth, and how that will connect to the lunar activity, I think it's really, really important. And we will be sharing infrastructures, transportation. We will be sharing technologies between the moon and the Earth. And then also, I think the resource utilization of the moon can really create this cislunar economy. And then there will be a connection that will be created between the LEO activities and the lunar activities. So the moon is important because it will impact Earth's economy and activities that we do on Earth.
So I'm going to follow up on that point because it's something, so I'm the black sheep of my family. I'm the only one that likes space and science and maths and whatnot. And when I talk with my family or friends that are not in the same industry, and they're like, oh, but it's such a waste of money going into space and doing these things on the Earth. And for me, it's a fundamental driver for what we can take from this ecosystem and apply it back onto the Earth. So I'm interested then for you guys, what do you see as the key things that we can take on the technology or societal whatnot and reapply onto the Earth and support on the situation on the Earth and the challenges we see here?
Well, if you think about making human beings living in maybe one of the most extreme environments that we can find in our proximity, this calls for technology to help save energy, to recycle water, get rid of CO2 in the atmosphere. And these are exactly the technologies that we need nowadays, unfortunately, on our planet. So often you hear indeed, yeah, okay, we are going to the moon and to Mars in order to colonize other planets because we are destroying this one here. It's not true. It's not about fleeing this planet. It's developing technology that should come back to our planet and help sustaining it, because we have quite big problems, I think, right now here. So, and this concerns only the habitation technology, where you really need that kind of solutions in order to make people live on a lunar surface. Mm-hmm.
And adding to that, first, let's just say also that the amount of money we spend on space, it's ridiculous compared to other expenditures that we have, right? I think we see it today with what's happening with the war. If we look at defense and military budgets, and then we look at the space budget, then we have totally an understanding of we're not really wasting so much money. So let's just try to focus on, we are actually spending not enough compared to the benefits that space brings to us. I mean, if we're here today having this event, is also because of space technologies. And it's going to be the same for the moon. And because I mean, my background in space law, so I will, pick up on Raphael's suggestion about, the societal challenges and the legal models that we can have. On the moon, we're going to hopefully leave an experiment with new governance models that on Earth we've not been able to develop because we've been so attached to the idea of state sovereignty, right? Most of the places on Earth are under the exclusive control of a state. And the places that are not are the exception. Whereas on the moon, it would be the opposite. Because no one can appropriate the moon under international space law. No one can exercise exclusive control on the moon. So when you hear, for instance, about safety zones, don't be worried. No one can keep you out of any part of the moon. So we will need to be able to live under this regime where the limited space that's maybe is going to be an installation or a starship or any spacecraft you can have there, where you can exercise your own little jurisdiction, that will be the exception. The rest of the space, we're going to share it, and we need new governance models for that. And we can learn from it. Maybe we can finally demonstrate that humans are able to live together, to share a space without someone with a big stick saying, if you don't do as I say, there's going to be bad events, Find ways to incentivize each other to cooperate not for the sake of, again, of being nice to each other, because this may sound all naive, but because it's the only way to survive. And on the moon, either we go in this way or we don't go at all. So.
Yeah, I'm going to give a couple of specific examples of things that people are planning for the moon and which you can use on Earth. But you're speaking about governance model. I just want to bring in the point. My vote is for Heinlein, the moon is a harsh mistress, which I think is a very good model. But a couple of specific examples. So we have a portfolio companies, based right here in Paris, called Interstellar Lab. And they're basically developing almost closed loop, very autonomous greenhouses, where the idea is that ultimately you use them in places like the moon or Mars. But of course, they'll also be very useful on Earth in regions where you cannot grow certain crops, well, outside, so to say. Another company that springs to mind, some of you may know, is based in Israel. It's called, unfortunately, it's not an investment of ours, it's called Helios. And they are working basically on a type of molten regolith, so regolith, the lunar sand, molten regolith electrolysis. With the original idea to split that into oxygen and then iron for the use on the moon, but then they figured out in the process they believe it may actually be a much better way to produce iron on Earth as well in a more efficient and a more sustainable way, which I think is very exciting.
Right. Another example that I can add onto that from Korea is that we have our Nuclear Research Institute, people being more interested in space because they think they have something to offer. For instance, they are actually working on these rovers, autonomous rovers that can go into nuclear detonated areas in case something happens, right? And then they share technologies that are actually needed in space. So they are interested in working on the lunar rovers, and this actually gives us an idea that yes, spin-offs are important, but also spin-ons are really important. Especially, I can tell at least for Korea, we're not. I wouldn't say we're that advanced in space technology yet, but we have all the infrastructure technologies, manufacturing technology, electronic technologies, nuclear technologies, and automobile industry, and cell phone industries, and we have those technologies that we can spin on. So maybe if we could create that spin on and then spin off cycle that goes between terrestrial and space industry, I think that would be the perfect ideal ecosystem that we can also create between the two industries.
No, I think that's something for me, and it's I always find it amazing that you have that phrase, necessity is the mother of invention. And when I listen to people to say, oh, but blah, 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 and it's limited by what we've already done in the past or what we've done for the last 50 years, 80 years, whatever. And so this is, for me, one of the key drivers as well, is to go, because we're going to discover new things. It's in our nature, and we're going to test these different boundaries. I have got other questions, but there's a couple of good questions in here already, so thank you for those. And it's something that's actually dear to my heart, because, as I say, communicating to my family as my sister's scrolling on Facebook or whatever, not realizing that it's thanks to these Silicon Valley types being inspired back in the day. So there's this notion of effective communication, okay, for the majority of the planet. There's 8 billion people. I'm sure everyone at IAC is completely sold on space and space exploration and why it's important, but everyone else outside, we're not really getting that message through. So the question is here, in your views, what are the key benefits in 10 years plus that the citizens will see with the moon exploration and exploitation that will help rising interests? And if I may also add, it will also help then to motivate the governments and European state members to spend that money. So I'd be interested in an answer to that question. Who would like to start?
I mean, it's about resources, and if you would have told maybe somebody 40 years ago that we start searching oil in 3,000-meter depth, nobody would have believed that. But today your car is driving with that, still yet. And I'm actually a fan of space mining. I believe that technology will bring us there. I worked in my career also in the maritime sector. I was always swimming a little bit between the sea and space. There's also this aspect of maritime or deep sea mining with exactly the same question marks and about legal aspects and technological aspects and things like that, but they are getting solved. And I think the same will happen with space and the moon, that in the future we will see a whole industry being constructed around that. And that will be a return to the people. I mean, a lot of people earn their money with that today, and I don't see why this shouldn't happen also with space. And then the other point is, of course, the inspiration. We mentioned it several times. And inspiration is not only about making little kids' eyes glow up. Again, especially here for Europe, it's about stopping a brain drain to nations like the US, where you have fantastic projects, fantastic programs, and a lot of young people that want to join these programs. We should have that here in Europe too. It's important. It's a real political aspect, putting missions like that on the feet.
Well, in 10 years, it's really too short to see a major infrastructure to be developed. So for me, the main benefit will really be the inspirational part, right? Already seeing humans hopefully returning to the surface of the moon. And I don't know, let's try to be realistic. Landing pads, safely allowing them to land and come back. I think that would be extremely inspiring already. You know, I think the ISS is a great demonstration of that. Every time you have an astronaut going there or making a short video, like we have Astro Samantha that we're so proud of, right? Every time she sends a message, the whole nation in Italy is, you know, excited about it. And she's just in low Earth orbit. I mean, just in low Earth orbit. Imagine, you know, having an astronaut from your country or any human actually connecting with you and doing a TikTok on the moon. It may sound a bit trivial, but it will prove that we can do these things. And as Peter said, it's not just for the kids, which I think it's important anyways, it's to ourselves. I think it's to show that we can do better things when we come together, when we focus our energies, and it create new opportunities for invention to continue, right? I really liked your quote, necessity is the mother of invention. And on the moon, we're gonna need a lot of things. There's gonna be a lot of necessity. So I think proving the case that this works, that we are there, that we're starting, will be an enormous message. Right now, I think a lot of people are following the Artemis 1 launch, which of course is taking its time, which we all know in this industry. But outside, people say, oh, they're not even able to launch this thing for the first time. We have to prove them not wrong, but we have to prove that this is hard, that we want to do it safely, and that we can achieve it. And I think just sending that message with people and infrastructure, even basic things, will be extremely powerful.
Yeah, I agree exactly with Antonino here. 10 years is a little bit too short to have something really meaningful. We're not going to have sort of a self-sustaining settlement. I don't believe so. I'd hope so, but it's probably not going to happen. But I do agree the inspiration aspect is just, we have to make sure that anything else that's happening in space, like closer to Earth, is going to become normal, because there's so much benefits we can derive from that, right? I mentioned the examples, the remote sensing and the in-space manufacturing and so forth. But to realize that potential of the space economy, we need the broadest possible support in the public, politicians, everything that we can get for the space sector. And one way, for better or worse, to kind of get large parts of the public roped in are these really, and I don't think it's wrong, are these really inspirational stories, like the moon and deep space exploration. I don't know how many people from my non-space circle were fascinated by James Webb. And those are the inspiring thing on the moon. Like, I truly believe when the next man and the first woman step on the lunar surface, they're going to be the most famous people on the planet, full stop. And that's going to be really important for everything else that we want to do in the space sector.
And I would like to echo what you have just said, that that inspiration is going to be the biggest benefit that we get for the next 10 years. And I myself used to think that it's a pity that I was not born as an American during the 1960s, because I missed that Apollo, moment. But now I feel like I'm very lucky that I can live this era to see this and be involved. And so I think that inspiration aspect is really the key benefit that we'll get. And then also, I think there should be at least one or two, a minimum number of success cases on return on investment. I know it's going to be really difficult to happen, but we need to have that in order to have more government investment, in order to have broader public support. We need to have at least a few successful cases, especially with the business, So hopefully that will happen.
So if I may add on something, I should also mention, I don't think we should discount the possibility that we make one or two interesting scientific discoveries, because we have a lot more assets. If all goes well, there's going to be a lot more assets going up, a lot more rovers, both publicly financed and privately financed rovers. And there might just be stuff that we discover that we didn't expect.
I think China just discovered a new mineral on the moon, and they call it Changisite, right? So those are the things that we also should look at. And the science that we can do on the moon, we often don't talk about it because it's more exciting to talk about humans or commercial plants. But there is a lot of science we can do in every part of the moon. Imagine, the James Webb is a great example. Imagine if we build a radio telescope on the far side of the moon that can really answer the question of where everything comes from. It's amazing, and we can do it only on the moon, actually. We can't even do it from Mars. We have to do it on the moon. So the science also will be a great driver, and I think science communication is a great role to play in how do we sell the moon as a case to the general public.
I totally support everything you're saying on that. And I'm just curious, because you're also looking at investment in medical science and whatnot as well. And I think that's something that's very interesting now for the next 10 years.
Oh, I think there's going to be tremendous things that we'll do in space related to biology, biotech, medicine. I mean, on the investing side, we're looking a little bit closer to Earth, so things that we can do in microgravity, including jointly with Airbus, I should add. But of course, it's going to be interesting. Again, we'll have to perfect certain things so we can safely take care of humans on the moon first. But even that is a few days round trip, right? And then let alone on Mars, right, where you know, if somebody has a medical problem that far away, that's going to be complicated. There's actually, some of you may know, a famous example from history here on Earth on the in the Soviet Antarctic station in the 1960s during the Antarctic winter. The only surgeon in the Soviet station got an appendicitis. Well, he self-operated. And so we have to make sure that we have sort of medical care guaranteed for the future astronauts on the moon and further places.
So, another question coming in. So just a question that I find interesting, because what I'm loving here, listening to this conversation, is obviously this openness for collaboration and needing to work together and each element bringing its value, okay? But so the question is, do you think it's realistic to imagine an international cooperation in the moon, given the geopolitical context? And I think what you said, but...
Well, yes, I think it's realistic. It's difficult, but it's not impossible or unrealistic. And also, like, we have, for those of you who are not aware, we have a UN committee dedicated to the peaceful use of outer space. It's called UN COPUOS. It was established in the 50s. And that was during the Cold War, right? And it started and it lasted until it actually overcame the Cold War. You know, COPUOS managed to bring the Soviet Union and the United States working together, and they were pointing nuclear missiles at each other. So I do think that in space, and especially on the moon, we have opportunities to demonstrate and actually overcome the problems we have on Earth. Of course, it's not easy, especially what is happening in Europe, but everyone at the table sees value in this. And again, it's not just because we want to be nice, it's because alone we're not going to go there, or it will not work. There is a problem, like Peter said, we're writing a paper together on safety zones, and we've been looking at how big is the South Pole of the moon. You know, it's like the Paris area. That means also connected to the geographical environment of the moon with the problems of lunar dust, that you cannot operate alone even if you want to. So cooperation does not necessarily mean that we'll have to do anything and everything together. It means that we need to be aware that we are in there together, despite the fact that we like it or not. And if we just close our eyes, it's not that the lunar dust will not come into your rover and destroy it. It's not that because you don't like a certain country, you can ignore the problems that being in the same area will create. So we need to be aware of that. I think we're all adults, we're all states, mature enough to engage at the UN, even when there are certain issues like that. And then we follow up. And in space, there is a strong incentive for that. Necessity, again, is the mother of all inventions, and in this case, of all cooperations, maybe.
Yeah, just comment on that. It depends a little bit how you define cooperation, but call it like you want. I mean, we are again in a space race today, clearly. And that's not only negative. I actually see it also positive, because it motivates. It's a motivator to go back to the moon. I mean, see the situation right now. NASA, USA, are planning to go back to the moon, South Pole. They have a very tight planning behind, because they want to be first there before other nations, before China, most probably, and that will lead to force them to keep up to the schedule, which is maybe a good thing. So I think it's not really negative, and it's also not negative in the sense of it will avoid us some kind of Apollo remake. this return to the moon will not finish with some funny flag being planted on the moon, because they already did that. So they have to go further. They have to explain to the taxpayer why are they doing that. So talking about sustainable presence on the lunar surface. And again, here Europe should play a role and come in with solutions and additional things. And also because I think the Chinese will not just end by putting a Chinese flag and not go back. So this is, it's not negative for me. It's not, we take maybe away the whole Cold War thing, but this race to the moon is, for me, it's not negative. It's a positive thing, actually.
Yeah, so that's exactly the point I was going to make, actually. And the anecdote, I mean, you said it all. And the anecdote I can add that some of you may know, at some point in time, they interviewed Wernher von Braun, and they asked them, like, but what could have happened if the Americans and the Soviets would have worked together? And Wernher von Braun, in his typical way, he was like, well, nobody would have gone to the moon.
Right. If I could also answer this question, I also would like to. You mentioned about COPOS. There's also ISEC-G, which is International Space Exploration Coordination Group, which I'm also a member of. So, and it has 27 member agencies right now, including China, Russia, Ukraine, United States, everybody, even Korea and some other emerging spacefaring nations. So there are different platforms. There's political platform, more R&D based platforms, but there are also NGOs and other entities that are working to create the governance model for the moon, and I guess it's a matter of how we're going to realize it. We all don't want to see a dystopia on the moon, so right.
I just want to add one thing, right? With going back to the Von Braun anecdote, which is true. Probably if they've merged effort completely, maybe they were not succeeded. But while they were developing their programs separately, they were discussing at the UN to create the Outer Space Treaty. Now, I would say if they would have not done that, then no one would have gone to the moon, or the first one to go would have been shot by the other. So it's important to keep in mind that we have different levels, right? On the scientific, commercial, technology, it's very good that we have a diverse plethora of actors engaging, competing even. I think that's really good. But we also need to have a common level playing field for regulation and governance that if we don't develop together, it will make the rest, I wouldn't say worthless, but it will make it more and more difficult to work, and if not, almost impossible, actually.
So I'm just looking at the time. We've only got 3 minutes left. So I'm going to, and thank you for all the questions. I'm going to ask one last question to end on a kind of positive note. And then what I'm going to recommend to you is if you want to continue the conversation, we will be having Meet the Moon team reception at the Airbus and Lockheed Martin stands directly after this is finished, where I will be having a glass of something. But I really like this question, so I want to finish on this one. What can be the opening door for non-technical people to contribute to space's current work is heavily focused on technical feasibility? And this comes back to your inspiration topic as well. So I don't know, Song-Young, for what you've been doing, maybe that's something you could start to answer?
So what was the question again? What would be the
opening door for non-technical people to contribute to space as it's currently focused on technical?
Right. The opening door. Well, the entertainment. I think you also mentioned about it at one point. So there are films being shot. Will be shot at the ISS, right? And then more entertainment industries coming along. And so it's going to make space and lunar activities more accessible to the public. And then I think the dialogues on the governance, actually, it is really going to open up a huge public debate. It's not only technical, although having technical understanding is a plus. So I think that political aspect will really open doors to the public.
Yeah, as a non-technical person, being here discussing lunar stuff, I can tell you that the door is already opening. So it's progressing, and organizations like the one that I work for, like the Open Lunar Foundation, but also SGAC, that's exactly what we're trying to do, right? We're going to have a dialogue, and we want to represent and provide. We want to be a voice for all civil society. That includes, and I would say goes beyond, engineers and astrophysicists, all people that we love and need. But humanity is much broader than that, right? This room is probably not just tech technical people, it's humans first, and it's people with different backgrounds. So the conversations that we need to have on what do we want to do on the moon and why do we want to do it, it's not a technical conversation, because we're all paying for it also. And it's not just engineers and scientists that pay for it, it's the society that pays for it, that will overcome also the consequences. If we fail on the moon and things go wrong, this will be bad for everyone. So engage in this conversation. That would be my also point. Not just wait for the door to be open to you, but come to us, to organizations like there is also Secure World Foundation and many others. That's what we're trying to do. We're going to bring this perspective to this forum, to the technical people, to the companies, but we can't do it without your voice. So come to us and we can discuss together and bring so many different perspectives that we all need to succeed at the end of the day.
So this is a very funny question for me as a venture capitalist, because the door is wide open. If anything, there's really a problem in hiring. I think almost every single portfolio company I have and all of the other many startups I know, they're all trying to hire people, including on the non-technical side. Many of them need sales, like commercial people, sales people, strategy people, biz dev people. Like, that's actually becoming a problem. In fact, my last talk right before this was we're launching something called a Space Business Certificate, where people can take a standardized test so they can enter the space sector in an easier way. Because I think it's incumbent on us that we have to help do away with the stereotype that this is only for rocket scientists. Yes. Because then we're going to be shooting ourselves in the foot.
I think time is over, so I won't repeat what just said, but there are lots of open doors, actually. It's said about many fields that are needed for doing what is seen here on the screen. Not only for technical people, we need everybody.
Cross the door.
Well, I'd like to thank you all so much. Thank you, the panel, for the really interesting discussion. Thank you to you for the great questions. And again, let's keep that conversation open and see how we can really make not only the door wide open for all, but that they know about it. And I will be happy to work with each and every one of you in the future as we go to the moon. So thank you very much. Enjoy your evening.